Yeah, that is important. Colonel Reynolds is recognized.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. So the first one is, I think I'm one of those people, right, that uses this stuff. And so one thing that I've been frustrated with for years is that it's very difficult to figure out what is available for decision-making and whether it's current or how current it is, whether it's forward-looking or whether it's just data. You know, like, well, what does that mean and what affects that? So what can our projects do that affect that indicator, right? Because it's just an indicator and it's mostly a result of climatological conditions, then I don't really care about it. I mean, we care as a body of science because it's still data that we need to collect, but I don't know that as a task force, it's particularly relevant to our decision-making, as an example, although it's still important science. So then where does that fall? You know, it still needs to be done. Maybe it needs to be done under this program. Maybe it needs to be done under one of the agencies as part of their program. So for me, it would be, what are the decisions that we're trying to make in the near future, and do we have indicators, whether they're system-wide ecological indicators, whether they're a single data, I'm going to use all the wrong science words, so I apologize, but is it a single piece of data or information that the Fish and Wildlife Service is already collecting because of a biological opinion? You know, for example, so if it's something that the Corps is already collecting and it's kind of good enough for decision-making over the next few years, well, like, we don't need to replicate that with 3 other types of reports. And maybe we still need to be collecting the science, but it doesn't need to be something that that we duplicate efforts, and we can really focus on a few things that make it simpler for managers to look at what data is really relevant for the near-term decision-making, and then maybe a longer-term decision-making, and are there triggers that help us realize something is working or not working? Like, hey, this path we're going down, in about 2 years' time, we should expect to see super colonies returning under these types of conditions. When we have those types of conditions, are we seeing super colonies? If we're not, something isn't going as we anticipated. You know, like, those types of things are really easy to communicate to the public, and they're really easy for managers to understand whether something's going right or going wrong. Because it's really easy to get bogged down in the data, I think. Because there's so much of it, and it all seems important, and it all is important for different purposes, but it doesn't always help us make decisions about the projects, which really have a lot to do with just moving water around. And so kind of figuring out what are those targets or anticipated events or activities or water levels or things like that that help us understand whether we're still on track or not, I think would be really relevant and really an important part of the conversation. The second thing that I wanted to bring up has to do with the priorities. And it sounds like all of these 7 or however many 6 items that Alan had on the first slide, like, they're all really good ideas and all really important. But I'm not sure I understand how we're setting up the priority framework. So I feel like the task force should have some priorities, and then the working group needs to have a work plan to get after ways to facilitate the task force's priorities, and the science coordination group should have different work plan to get after their way to support the task force's priorities. And it seems like we're always developing the priorities too late. So that we've already been working on stuff, and then we're telling the task force, this is what you need to think is important, because this is the work we did. And I'd like to get ahead of that. I know it's going to, it's going to take like a year for us to get ahead of that, but I'd like us to kind of think about how do we develop that framework for the task force principals to help them tell us what we need to be focusing on?
Yeah.
Because everything, we know this stuff, all of these things are important, but I don't know that we all have the resources to support all of those, so I'm a little bit hesitant to say how many resources I have to support priority number one until I understand the other five and if they have a order or not.
Can I jump in on that one from behind you, Susan? I'm sorry. That's something we've been looking at in our office. Obviously, what we wanted to do was come back and provide y'all with this initial, okay, here's where we are, make sure we're on the right path for some of these things, recognizing that some of these efforts, as you see as we walk through them, are going to be more working group member, SEG member intensive, and others are quite frankly more staff intensive. So there's going to be a balance for you on that once we walk through them, and we definitely are developing work plans that will come more clear. Didn't want to jump in and do that ahead of having this conversation and getting some feedback and input from y'all.
And I guess I would add that in my experience how the science fits in, it sounded the warning. The science in the 80s and 90s was part of sounding the warning about the degradation of the system, which then led to the development of the plans and the projects to address some of the changes that we saw. But we need to make sure that you're absolutely right, that our priorities or our comments are linked into the task force priorities. And I've not seen a lot, it's been a while since I've seen that, what I would call top-down direction. And I think that what we're trying to do is plug the gap and build from the bottom up and then say, because every conversation I've had is if, I hear managers say, tell me what I need to know, and I'll say, tell me what you want to know. And somehow that's been one of the great disconnects that continues. And I'm hoping that, unfortunately, I guess Chris stepped out for a minute, but that's part of the challenge. He's gone? He gave up? Oh, dear. So we need that two-way conversation, and I don't think that's happened maybe as much as it could.
Nick?
Yeah, I think you made some really good comments, and one I want to focus on is the process called co-production, and I think that's really what we're trying to do here, where the initial, especially at the very beginning, that both the producers and the users of the science are working together to make sure that there's concert there. And I will say that we've done this before. We did this with the first set, and it was not an easy process, and yeah, everybody wanted everything, but we, I think, really did the best job that could be done to winnow that down to something that really helps tell us what we always say, that this project is about getting the water right, in all these different facets. And unless we go out in a scientific way and make sure that connection is, that those water levels that we're trying to achieve, or the flows, or the distribution, timing, it really is producing some really good scientific outcomes, which is why we're doing this all in the first place. I think it's really important. It's also our job as scientists to really interpret those data, because there are many other things that cause those indicators to change too. And one of the hard things we have to do is go through and sort out what the driving forces are and how much we can ascribe to work that we've done in the ecosystem. It's a complex system. There's a lot of moving parts ecologically, and I still think, I always say this, we don't know a lot that we don't know. We really don't know some of these processes as well as we should. But in the end, this is a science-based effort, and I think this next iteration, especially from a co-production standpoint, will produce really good, useful indicators, and just improve on what we have.
I like that co-production.
Dave?
All those points are really important, and some of the points, particularly your points, Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds, speak to multi-scale. In time, we have questions. Should be question-driven, management questions. Some questions are local in space. some are about a project that's, developing. But our monitoring programs ideally would be designed to be multi-scale, to be able to zoom in on a local area, but also be able to speak system-wide. And some, if you look at this one graph that's shown in every biennial report that has ovals that show kind of time and space, that some indicators reflect long periods of time and big areas, and other indicators are finer scale, quicker response. And that's well thought out. That's exactly what we need. But when you drill down to how do you implement this, this speaks to the sampling design that's in the field, and that speaks to the cost of the program. And Susan, you had a graph, you even mentioned, you had an example with the GRTS, which is one of our basically cross-system look at the plant community and other elements of the system in a really rigorous statistical design. Well, is that what we need? I would say yes, but there's many other components in our monitoring plan. So you can't separate the indicators themselves as something that, let's say you pick roseate spoonbills. Okay, well, that has its own monitoring design. Or if you added a plant community structure, that would be part of a different component of the monitoring at different scales. So we could say, well, we want this charismatic species because the public recognizes it and we think it reflects our projects. You have to make sure that you're capable of having a monitoring program that captures that and that you really are getting the information you want. And you want the monitoring designs to be integrated so that you can get better insight as to what's causing the responses that you see, that you're not misinterpreting a good response for the wrong reason, or you're missing a good response. It's being masked. There's some other negative. So this is an intricate exercise. It's not just a workshop where you vote for your favorite indicator. You have to think deeply about how you actually get the information and be able to translate it in a way that is relevant to the managerial questions. So it's a big deal. It's not, you really need people who have a lot of experience and knowledge to be able to go through this decision-making process. So we need this, but it will cost time and really require the right people.
And that's the commitment of resources,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah, it's a serious commitment.
Yeah. All right, so we've heard a lot. Adam?
Yeah, I'm venturing off into an area where there's a lot more expertise than I have on this subject matter, but I'm gonna jump in, like Bob and others at the table here, Brad and so forth. But maybe there's a need to look at interim ecological indicators, because some of these look like they're the long-term full build-out of the system that some anticipated we'd be nearly close to at this particular time. And because maybe we're not as far along as we should have been, maybe there's some interim targets and goals of ecological indicators that would be better benefited from picking up smaller scale changes and reaping those benefits from those individual projects that are going to be starting to come online, and having a long-term goal of monitoring these higher trophic level indicators in the system.
Colonel?
I think one other thing to think about as we're talking about these indicators and how we execute them, and this is something that goes along with what you just said, Dave, is, sometimes we need to communicate things for a different reason than the actual science. But it doesn't make those any less important. It just means that maybe we can do it differently. Maybe the science can be less intense or less specific. or even anecdotal and still meet our communications messages. And so identifying those, I think, is also important, because then those become maybe not really a focus for the science coordination group to work on, or the interagency science team to work on, but it's something that we can rely on, some kind of a local effort that's already happening that we can just help report and communicate as, you know, an infographic for the public to help understand that sometimes it isn't our projects that are necessarily providing the responses. Sometimes it's, we're not sure what, and sometimes it doesn't really matter what. You know, sometimes it's okay for us to just say, hey, there's these great things going on, more manatee babies than in the last 10 years, more, you know, ducks in the STAs. Sorry, Water Management District, I know that's always a source point when STAs get used for all the various recreational opportunities that are not maybe as compatible with our water management needs. But those things matter, right? In the sense that the public wants to see some of these charismatic species responses, but maybe there isn't really any science we need to do to be able to communicate those, and those become a communication part of the work plan rather than the science part of the work plan. And we find the easiest way to pull that non-scientific but still accurate data, and maybe non-scientific isn't the right word, but, you know, not intense science data, but it's a communication data requirement rather than a science data requirement.